This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. This time of year, people often think of witches, but in the context of Halloween. Yet New England's colonial history included a dark time when people, both women and men, were hanged. Some of them met their end because they didn't conform to the strict Puritan standards and way of life during that time. The witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts gets the most attention, but the first witch hanging in America actually happened in Windsor, Connecticut in 1647. Today, Where We Live, we talk to author Beth Caruso, who's written a historical novel based on the Connecticut incident. It's called One of Windsor. Have you read it? Or do you know about other witch hangings that happened in your Connecticut town? We want to hear from you. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. As always, find us on Facebook and Twitter at Where We Live. Beth Caruso joins me in studio. Beth, welcome to our show.
Thank you for having me, Lucy. I'm thrilled to be here.
You're actually a Connecticut resident. So tell us about this book was, I believe, your first historical novel?
Yes, One of Windsor is the first novel, and I decided to write One of Windsor because I was talking to a neighbor one day. I'm not originally from Connecticut. I'm from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was talking with her about going to Salem for the first time with my family. And she said to me, her name is Joan, she said, "You know, Beth, the very first witch trial victim was from this town. She was a resident of Windsor." And I was absolutely stunned because I hadn't heard this before. There were no signs anywhere in Windsor that I could see that this woman had hanged. And quite honestly, I found it to be an outrage because here was the first case of a woman being accused of witchcraft. And like you said, there were men too. But in this case, she was a woman. And she was hanged for this crime, for this horrific crime, where they accused her of being aligned with the devil to do harm to her community. This first case sparked the rest of the witch trial history for colonial New England and all of colonial America, and led all the way up to Salem. Salem was the inferno, but this was the spark that started it all. And I thought, what an injustice not to know about it. What a sad thing not to know about this history and to know more about her.
How did your friend know of this particular account? Because as you mentioned, it's not really talked about in this state.
I'm not really sure. There are a few people in Windsor who knew about it at that point. You know, there was talk, but they didn't know many details about it.
And because of that, again, you said this really sparked your interest in learning about her. But because there's not a lot maybe of anecdotes or written documents, so tell us, I guess, the research that you had to start and where you went to begin to tell the story.
Well, I think Joan told me about this probably before 2010 even, and there's really very little information about her. There's only two direct records, in fact. The first one is a journal entry by John Winthrop, the founder of Massachusetts Bay Colony, who said, "One blank of Windsor arraigned and executed for a witch." And this was in his journal around the spring of 1647. It was years that nobody knew the name of this person. In fact, they often confused her with Mary Johnson, the second witch trial victim from Wethersfield, the second Connecticut witch trial victim. There was one earlier in Boston. But it wasn't until the late 1800s that the Matthew Grant diary was found. But what the Matthew Grant diary actually was the Old Windsor church record. A child of Oliver Ellsworth was actually walking in the rubble of a building that was torn down that had been owned by a descendant of Matthew Grant. And he found this treasure. He didn't know what it was. It was just this old book. And luckily, he brought it to his father, who brought it to the town minister, who said, "Oh, this is something important." And he gave it to J. Hammond Trumbull, who was our first state librarian and a historian. And J. Hammond Trumbull found on the inside cover a notation that said, Alice Young was hanged May the 26th, 47. And that was the very first time that we even knew her name.
This document, is it now still with the Connecticut State Library? How did you learn of it?
Well, it's online at the Connecticut State Library now. You can go there and find all about it. You cannot go get the book and put it in your hands as I wanted to do. But it's there, and it's loaded with a lot of important information. It wasn't just that was important about that diary. There are a lot of old sermons and church records. What I found the most important were the vital statistics that are listed in that Matthew Grant diary.
And Matthew Grant is a resident of Windsor at the time?
Yes, he was the second town recorder of Windsor. And he is the one who wrote this original notation that actually had Alice Young's name.
So tell us more about your research process, because you were also looking at town maps. You were thinking about who may have lived around this particular woman. And so plot that out for us.
Well, for years I just read background about the Puritans because I had nothing to go on to find out about this woman. And I have to say, as far as women's history, as far as Native American history, as far as African American history, sometimes the direct documentation about these people is just not there. And you have to go about things in a very roundabout way. So I finally realized this in 2013, and I'm reading something about how important neighborhoods were in Puritan communities, more important than the church community or the town community. And I thought, that's it. I need to figure out what her neighborhood was like in 1647. Who was she surrounded with? And I took Windsor land records and realized that she was in the middle of this larger family called the Tinker family. And this family, they had come from Windsor, England. And, well, the town is called Windsor, Connecticut. But anyway, nobody realized this, and even the historian Henry Stiles, he never pointed out that there was this other separate group, because all these people were women who were the Tinkers, except for one, and one was a brother who was John Tinker, who actually was assistant to John Winthrop Jr., who is the person who ends up stopping the witch trials in Connecticut. It was interesting because another person who was on Backer Row where she lived, who was part of this Tinker family, a husband of one of the Tinker sisters, was actually mentioned during the Salem witch trials at the bedside of Margaret Rule. So there were all these fascinating connections. But as far as why Alice Young was hanged, I think it fed into part of the reasons because she was from a minority group. The largest group in town were from Dorchester. They were from the West Country, the southwest of England, and that may have put her at odds. Also, a connection with the Tinker family and Tinkers having a relationship with Winthrop may have fed into it too. Winthrop at the time was an interloper in Connecticut. He was starting New London as an alchemical center, and they were wary of him. So it wasn't until much later that Winthrop became a doctor for a lot of Connecticut and became someone well-respected and someone involved in stopping witch trials and a governor for 20 years. At that point, a connection with him may have not been as much of a good thing.
My guest today is Beth Caruso. She's author of One of Windsor, the untold story of America's first witch hanging. It happened in Windsor, Connecticut in 1647. Beth, you've introduced a lot of different names for our listeners. Again, the focus of this book, the story of the woman that was hanged, Alice Young. Because she lived in this particular land plot with this family tinker, was she then, from that, could you glean that maybe she was someone who was a servant to them?
Well, I'm not sure. I don't think she was a servant to the Tinker family. I think either her or her husband were either part of that family or connected to them, maybe from the old country. And the reason why I say that is because not only were they smack in the middle of this family, they also happened to this family also happened to leave right after Alice Young's hanging, which does suggest a connection. They all cleared out of town afterwards.
Because of stigma, fear that it would happen to them.
Well, yes, that often happened. You know, Alice Young had a daughter, Alice Young Beeman, who married a Beeman in Windsor, and they moved to Springfield. And there they had many children, and she was later accused of witchcraft crimes. Luckily, she was not indicted. She had a son who stuck up for her, and she did not hang. But with Alice, I think the main issue with that situation, pairing the land records with the vital statistics from the Matthew Grant Diary, you can see that the year that Alice Young hanged, it was a year of a major influenza epidemic. And looking at it from an epidemiological perspective, there were a cluster of people that died on Backer Row and right next door to Alice Young. I mentioned the person who was connected to Salem later on. It was actually his children. He lost most of his family. The other part of that is there were very important people in town who also lost their children. The town minister lost two people, two of his children actually. The town doctor lost his child. And flu, it often does take young people and it takes elderly. You know, with the witch trials, things are associated with them like fits and hysteria and talking in a way that might indicate some confusion, seeing the devil. Well, if you think about it, if somebody has a high fever, then they can get confused. If someone has an extremely high fever, like children, they have febrile seizures on occasion. So all these things can be connected.
I mentioned your book, One of Windsor. It's been out for a few years now, so some of our listeners may have read it already. But this is actually historical. It's a historical novel. So even though the characters are real people at one time, you took some liberties in telling the story. Was that challenging?
Well, there are many possibilities with what actually happened in the case of Alice Young. And with a novel, you have to choose one pathway. So I really chose what spoke emotionally to me the most. It was important that I bring Alice Young to life in a way that really touched people's hearts. So I wanted it to be a story that was full of beauty because I wanted people to feel the loss of this real person after they read the novel. So they would really understand what a witch trial accusation that led to a hanging meant. It meant someone's life was snuffed out, someone who had a full life with richness, with many layers. So that was important. Now, the history, of course, is also important to me, too. So in making the creative decisions and the literary decisions, I also put a section in the back of the book which describes what's real and what's not.
You can join our conversation. Again, we're talking about the first witch hanging in America that happened right here in Connecticut, in Windsor, many years before, the epicenter of witch trials. It happened in Salem, Massachusetts. You can join us 888-720-9677. We were actually talking about the Connecticut State Library, and joining us now on the phone is Christine Pitsley, who's project director at the Connecticut State Library, right on Capitol Ave in Hartford. If you haven't been there, it's a great place to check out. Christine, welcome to the show.
Hi, thanks for having me on.
So I understand as project director, you helped digitize and update this transcription of the Matthew Grant diary that Beth Caruso mentioned. Tell us more.
Yeah, that was actually my very first project when I started here back in 2008, and I had the privilege of actually handling this diary, which, is a treasure, and it's tiny. And we did a high-resolution digitization of it. So we used our camera and got really good images revised the transcript that had been done by Jessie Parsons back at the turn of the century. There was a lot that she had left out, and so we kind of updated that, and seeing that inside cover where Alice Young is mentioned was stunning to me. I had never, like most of your listeners, had never heard that Connecticut had witches.
Mm. Since Beth Caruso wrote her book, do you find that more people are interested to learn about this particular diary and other documents at the State Library, Christine?
Absolutely. We've got not only the Matthew Grant diary, but the Samuel Willis papers, which document several other women who were accused, women and men, that were accused and hung for witchcraft.
Well, that's really fascinating. We're going to actually talk more about some of these other people that were hanged in Connecticut. But I want to thank Christine Pitsley from the Connecticut State Library, project director there, for calling in here on Where We Live. You can join us, too, especially if you live in another town where there was a victim of a witch hanging in Connecticut. This happened in the 17th century. The number 888-720-9677. My guest, Beth Caruso, author of One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's first witch hanging. We'll be back after a short break. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. My guest is author Beth Caruso. Her book is called One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's First Witch Hanging. It tells the story of Alice Young, who was executed in 1647 and is the first recorded instance in colonial America. Now, Young wasn't the only Connecticut resident to be accused of being a witch. Women and men were tried and hanged in the 17th century in our state, not just in the town of Windsor, but also Wethersfield, Hartford, Stratford, Farmington, among others. Do you live in these towns, or are you familiar with the Connecticut witch trials? We want to hear from you. 888-720-9677. That's 888-720-WNPR. Beth, again, you were telling us about your research. It took many years before your book was completed, One of Windsor. I was wondering if you would have time to read a little excerpt from your book.
Sure. Let me set this up for you. Alice Young, before she became Alice Young in my story, is Alice Ashby, and she was a servant to the Holman family that came over to settle in Cambridge, which was then Newtown. So this is the first night that they're in Boston, and then they're at an inn, and they're eating dinner, and they're here with talking with Goodman Humphrey, who is a very dramatic man who's been to the colonies 3 different times, and he's telling them what to be wary of when they're here and trying to survive. So this is him speaking. When I first came here, people were dying continually for want of food and medicine. Each woman had to do the work for 4 men, not just her husband, because there were so few women folk. I remember one family in particular, 'twas the Carter family from Essex. They came one fine autumn day such as this, By springtime, the whole lot of them was dead. Even though the Indians helped us some, the harshness of winter was too much for most, he said, and belched. Continuing, he said, mind you, one must be prepared to make it in these parts, for danger lurks around every corner. Pestilence, hunger, loathing of the hard work, boredom, and missing the homeland will surely kill many more. You had best hope you are among the lucky ones, and you've the smarts to survive here. Alice looked on wide-eyed, determined to absorb any useful pieces of survival information. She looked at Winifred seriously and asked, will we survive in this strange new land, Mistress Winifred?
Again, that's Beth Caruso, author of One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's First Witch Hanging, here on Where We Live. I think you do a good job in the book of setting up, again, the stress and the uncertainty many had coming over to the Bay Colony, and then Alice Young making her way to Connecticut. Tell us more about what was going on socially when she arrived in the colony, and what did she think from, again, you took some liberties and painting a picture of this woman for us and what she was like as a person, but what she would have thought of this particular place after being in England, closer to a metropolitan area.
Well, during this time, it was there was a large level of insecurity and fears built up. At the pulpits, in the churches, the ministers preached, to be wary. There's the devil lurking around every corner. They viewed the wilderness as the domain of the devil, as something that needed to be settled for Christ. And so there they were, here for religious reasons, to settle the land, to convert the natives, to make it ordered and understandable. But they were really in small pockets of wilderness, a wilderness that they didn't truly know about. They hadn't experienced all there was out in the wilderness. They had a misunderstanding of Native people. They didn't know where the end of the wilderness even was. So it was a scary place for them, and they were little pockets in the middle of that. Couple that, besides that fear of the wilderness and the religious fears of the time about the devil lurking around every corner, there was the religious feeling of predestination, and only a few people were chosen to go to heaven. So that was a little bit scary to people too. Plus, they had no science to understand why certain situations happened, whether it be weather, whether it be diseases and illness. They were battling just to survive. They were starting their crops. They were starting their orchards. They were starting animal husbandry. And if they didn't survive, like in that passage indicated, the settlement would be difficult. It would be difficult for people to go on. So there were all those fears, and they needed explanation. And the belief in magic was alive and well. People practiced everyday magic all the time, as far as protection spells. There was some basic divination that they used with like Bibles and key tween girls, just like they do today, I'm sure.
In your book, you get the sense that it was also hard to be a young woman, who has yet to find a husband and to conform to the Puritan standards.
Yes, absolutely. Women didn't have a lot of power in those days. And men spoke for them. Men owned everything. Women had to follow in line. They didn't really have much of a voice of their own. And the women that did find their own voice and become independent, those were the ones who were targeted.
Earlier, you set up for our listeners some of the reasons behind why Alice Young may have been hanged, and that had to do with the sickness that was in that particular neighborhood at the time. Tell us more when you also talk about your book around the state. And I mentioned that there are other cases of residents in Connecticut that were hanged. Were those accusations similar? Were there other sicknesses that led people to be accused?
Well, there were all kinds of reasons that people pointed fingers at their neighbors to accuse them of witchcraft. I want to tell you the story about Lydia Gilbert, also a Windsor person. This was very, very strange. In 1651, the militia was practicing on the town green, and Thomas Allen, a 19-year-old kid, he's mishandling his gun, and he accidentally kills Henry Stiles, an older gentleman. Well, he has to go to court. His family has to pay a fine. Thomas Allen is not allowed to carry a gun for a whole year. You would think it's pretty much settled, right? No, not at all. The Allen family was a very well-to-do family. I guess they decided they needed to protect their reputation. So what happened was poor Lydia Gilbert gets accused of bewitching the gun that killed Henry Stiles several years, from 3 years before. Mm-hmm. How is that even possible? It turns out that Henry Stiles had been a boarder with the Gilberts, and maybe the fines weren't fully paid. So, to the Gilbert family, that may have been a part of it. But in any case, Thomas Allen marries the preacher's daughter after this whole thing happens. So his reputation is cleared, and the Allen family gets to have their fine returned to them. And poor Lydia gets indicted for bewitching that gun.
And when people were accused at that time, the trials happened in Hartford?
Yes, the hangings were actually in Hartford. There were 11 Connecticut witch trial victims. 9 of them were hanged right here in Hartford, probably not very far from where we're sitting right now.
Do you think near the State House?
Well, there are different theories about where they were hanged. One is at the old State House, and as I said, in novels you have to choose which path you're going to go. That was the path that I chose. At the old State House site, that was Meeting House Square, there were stocks, there were pillories, there was a jail cell on the northwest corner there. So some people speculate they could have been hanged there. But Dr. DeVos Love, he was a minister, he talked about the hanging site being actually down Albany Avenue on a hill, probably, right around St. Francis, right around here. So kind of spooky, huh, thinking about it. But other people say it's Trinity Hill, but historians I've talked to say they don't believe it's there. They say that's a site for hangings during Revolutionary times.
Beth Caruso is my in-studio guest, author of One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's First Witch Hanging. It was in 1647. Alice Young was her name, a resident of Windsor. Again, you can join our conversation, 888-720-9677. Virginia is calling from Farmington. Virginia, you're on the show.
Well, hello, Lucy. Hi, Beth.
Hi. I know the Virginia I'm talking to.
Yes.
So tell us.
We have a common bond.
Tell us, Virginia, what is your connection to Beth or even this subject of Connecticut witch trials?
Well, I became familiar with the fact that Connecticut was hanging witches long before Salem years ago when I was working with the Stanley Whitman House here in Farmington. And Lisa Johnson, the director, wrote a play, the Witchcraft Trial of Mary Barnes. Mary Barnes was a woman in Farmington who was hanged for witchcraft, was one of the last people to be hanged for witchcraft in Connecticut. And that stirred my interest, just as Beth hearing from her friend that we had been hanging witches. And that got me so interested in exploring the history and the stories and coming up with a one-woman play that I do that brings to life 5 women who were accused of witchcraft in Connecticut. It's a fascinating part of our history that people are now beginning to acknowledge, I think, and learn about.
Well, thank you, Virginia, for calling into the show to tell us about that play. I wanted to ask you, Beth, when we talk about, again, the 11 residents who were hanged in Connecticut, we referenced that some of them were men. Why was there that connection? How were they connected to women who may have been accused?
They were married to them, basically. In the case of John and Joan Carrington, we're not sure what the crime was. We know that John Carrington had committed the previous crime of selling a gun to a native, and that often set you up for a later witch trial accusation. We don't really know a lot about them as far as Rebecca and Nathaniel Greensmith. Rebecca Greensmith was on trial, and she decided she wasn't going down alone. So even though her husband was pleading with her to please stop talking this nonsense about me, she said, no, he's a witch too. And she pleaded, he pleaded, please, let me take care of the children. No, he was there. He was dancing around the circle at Christmas time with the devil with me too, and she brought him down.
We should mention as well that since you've written your book, there has been, as Virginia mentioned, a lot of interest in the Connecticut witch trials because you had mentioned earlier as well that it's hard to figure out where some of these hangings took place. Is that one of the reasons that Connecticut has not talked about these witch trials versus Salem, Massachusetts, where there may be more information about where these witch trials happened, maybe artifacts from that time?
Well, I think there's several reasons. One is that the witch trials were stopped here earlier by Winthrop Jr. And the other reason, which I think is the more dominant reason, is that there are so few trial records. There's so little information. I should point out, Virginia, when she called earlier, she was talking about the Stanley Whitman House. Virginia is from Her Story Theater, by the way. But at the Stanley Whitman House, they've combined a lot of records from the witch trials here with the Willis papers that the state librarian talked about before. But relatively speaking, relative to Salem, there are very, very few records.
I wanted to take a quick call. Nicole's actually calling in from Windsor. I understand you're the senior minister at First Church. Tell us about your connection to what we're talking about today, Nicole.
Yes, so I'm the senior minister at First Church in Windsor, and I met Beth when she was working on this project and realized that our church had a role. You know, back in the 1600s, of course, there was a connection between town government, church government. The role of the pastor had sway, and so we realized that part of talk about our church is that acknowledging our role in the kind of the bad history of the witch trials and the witch hangings. So we actually issued an apology on behalf of our church and publicly did that and supported a town resolution to acknowledge. And we were hoping for more of an apology, but an acknowledgement went a long ways.
Well, thank you, Nicole, for calling in and telling us that really interesting part of some of the awareness in recent years. I should mention the Windsor Town Hall, or Town Council, voted unanimously in February of 2017 to clear the names of Alice Young and Lydia Gilbert, two of the victims that we mentioned. We just have a couple of minutes left. Beth, when you heard that Windsor was doing that, what was your reaction?
Well, I was actually participating with Reverend Nicole Yonkman, who just called in, and Reverend Char Corbett, as well as the Mayor of Windsor, Donald Trinks, Tony Grigo, Brianna Dunlap. We all came together. The church decided that was something they wanted to do, and so it was very important because it symbolically cleared the names of our witch trial victims.
Again, Beth Caruso was my guest today, author of One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's First Witch Hanging. Before you go, you have a new book, The Salty Rose. Can you briefly tell us about it?
Yes, The Salty Rose. It is a sequel to One of Windsor, but it can be read on its own. It's the story of the secret influences behind the takeover of New Amsterdam, which later became New York City. It's told in the voice of a salty tavern keeper who conveys to her grandchild her interactions with getting into trouble with the law, but also with some folks from Connecticut, which are from One of Windsor.
Well, we can't wait to hear more about this book. We'll have to have you come back to talk about The Salty Rose for our listeners. But again, Beth, it's been a pleasure to speak with you. And again, the book is called One of Windsor, The Untold Story of America's First Witch Hanging. Beth, thank you.
Thank you, Lucy. It's been my pleasure.
This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Up next, we talk about Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine in East Granby, which attracts history buffs and scientists. We'll explain after the break. This is Where We Live from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. The old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine in East Granby is now opened to the public after being closed for many years. The site has a rich history. It dates back to the 18th century. The prison was used during the Revolutionary War and held British prisoners. But today, scientists are also interested in Old Newgate because it's the home to bats. To tell us more, joining me now in studio is Patrick Skahill, science and environment reporter for Connecticut Public. Patrick, welcome back.
Hi, Lucy.
So today we wanted to talk about bats. This is something that you have done reporting on before, specifically looking at white nose syndrome. But the most recent story was you actually traveled to this really cool place in Connecticut, Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine in East Granby, to learn about a survey of bats there. Tell us about what made you go.
Yeah, so Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine is located on the Metacomet Trail Ridge, as you said, in East Granby. This was a copper mine, a colonial copper mine from 1705 until about the 1750s. Didn't really do very well. The ore that they had in there was pretty bad, and they actually had to kind of ship it out of state to actually get it smelted and get copper out of it. So they decided, okay, well, we'll turn it into a prison, which they did, and it was a prison from 1773 till about 1827. Today, it's a tourist attraction, and it's also, as I learned, a home for a few bats right now in Connecticut.
You mentioned a tourist attraction. I've actually been there with my family, and people who visit can actually go into the cave, which is what you did. Before we get to your trip inside and underneath the ground, tell us about what kind of bats we find at Old Newgate.
Sure. So not many would be the short answer. During the last survey that the Connecticut Department of Energy and Environmental Protection did there last winter, they found only 10 bats in the survey. So the numbers are really, really low. This is reflective of declining populations all around Connecticut, all around a major part of the U.S. So bat populations right now are not doing very well.
And that's because of white nose syndrome. Tell us about that disease.
Yeah, so white nose is a fungal disease, and this is really the primary cause of this decline. This was a disease that was first noticed in New York State in the winter of 2006 to 2007. It's just spread very, very rapidly since then. Now it's been documented in at least 33 states, 7 Canadian provinces since that first appearance. And as a result of these declines, in Connecticut in particular, cave-dwelling bat species have just declined catastrophically. And really have not recovered over the past decade. So we've seen declines in species like little brown bats, declines in species like tricolored bats, and the northern long-eared bat as well was another one that declined. And actually, I spoke with a biologist with the State Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, Kate Moran, and here's what she had to say about that species.
In New England, bats were very common. So the northern long-eared bat was probably the most common bat we had throughout New England. Now it is the least common bat we have in New England.
So can you tell us more? So the fungus is found in these caves. It impacts these cave-dwelling bats. But what exactly does it do to the bat if it gets the fungus on them?
Right. So the short description there is the fungus gets on the muzzle and the wings of the bats, and it essentially kind of wakes them up when they're hibernating. And when it does that, the bat wakes up, it's expending more energy, and it depletes the fat reserves that the bat had in place to overwinter, to hibernate. When that happens, that's bad for the bat, and if those fat reserves run out, that can be it for the bat. And that's what's happened.
And why should people care about these particular bats, Patrick?
Well, bats are, I guess, so there's maybe several answers to that question. The first, from the selfish human perspective, right, is, well, they're helpful to us. They prey on moths and beetles that can be hindrances to human crops. They also prey on mosquitoes, which, obviously have been in the news recently here in Connecticut because of diseases like Triple E and West Nile virus. So they help us out a lot too. And of course, they have, myriad ecological benefits to other animals, to the ecosystem that they're in. So they're important to the world.
Before we talk more about your visit inside, again, Old Newgate Prison and Copper Mine, some of the other reporting that you've done, you've met up with researchers that are actually listening to bat calls. What is that telling them?
Yeah, so, one of the things that researchers are trying to do now is focus on the bats who have been able to survive white nose syndrome. Like we were saying, many species of bats have declined dramatically. We had mentioned the little brown bat going down, the tricolored bat, the northern long-eared bat. All of these bats are not doing well. There is another bat species, the big brown bat. This species has also declined, but it hasn't hit the sort of dire levels that other species have. So researchers have been focusing on that bat to essentially kind of see where they are, what they're doing. And one way you can do that is, just because you can't be everywhere at once, is you can set up microphones. So researchers have set up microphones all around the state to record bat calls. They can figure out where the bats are, what they're feeding on, what kind of things they're doing in that area, and they can learn a lot from that.
We heard from Kate Moran. You also spoke to another staff member at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection about efforts to conserve the bats. What did he tell you? Yeah, so another biologist that I met with, his name was Brian Hess. One of the projects he mentioned was an interesting one, and sort of one that, when you think about it, just makes perfect sense. So in the past few months and years, there have been programs to install cave gates around the state. And that's important, A, because you're not going in and disturbing bats when they're trying to sleep, or hibernate rather. And B, one of the big issues with white nose is how it spreads, right? So white nose is a disease currently that Brian Hess said is
pretty much to Deep's knowledge, found in all caves in Connecticut. And, one of the things that goes along with it being in all those caves is that if people go into those caves, they can spread the disease by getting the fungus on their clothes or on their shoes. So biologists have to be really careful about spreading that.
Well, it's interesting. When we visited, they made sure that we're wiping our feet before we enter the cave,
right,
so to speak, to go down into the mine, and then also when we're coming out. You mentioned also that this fungus is found in all caves in Connecticut, which I think is problematic, but there are certain parts of the cave that might actually be safer for bats because of the fungus isn't there?
Yeah, so the fungus does really well in specific conditions within a cave. Let's actually just hear from Brian Hess on that issue right now, though.
There are little microclimates within caves that can help bats to survive that fungal load because the fungus doesn't grow quite as well if it's warmer or cooler or more or less humid than the fungus really, really likes.
Yeah, and one other thing worth mentioning too is the fungus does not do well when it is exposed to UV rays or higher temperatures. So if a bat is able to get through the winter with this fungus on their body and emerge when winter's gone, when they go into the sunlight, that's going to kill the fungus, and then that gives the bat some time to recuperate.
Besides learning about more about white nose syndrome in Connecticut, are biologists optimistic in terms of the bat population? Because you said earlier, that there's so few bats that are remaining in this cave compared to more than a decade ago.
Yeah. That's a really difficult question. I mean, I think so. Bats haven't gone away entirely, right? They haven't, as Brian Hess said, they haven't blinked out, is what he told me. And there is a reason for cautious optimism there. There's a reason to still try to conserve these types of species because there are survivors. There are bats that are making it through the winter. But the numbers they're really bad, and they've been bad over the past decade, and they're not showing any indication of getting better in the nearer term. I don't think we want to be completely doom and gloom about it, but it's not a good situation right now. And white nose is a disease that has been spreading even further. This in 2016 popped up in Washington State, which raised an issue of, well, maybe we're not doing a good job at cleaning our boots, cleaning our clothes when we're leaving these caves, because it basically transplanted itself from the eastern part of the U.S. all the way across the country, and bats can't fly that far. So that must have been on a hiker's coat, it must have been on their shoes, and they must have transported it there. So biologists are trying to be optimistic, but they're also trying to just educate the public about the importance of conserving this vital species.
And what do scientists know about a bat's life cycle that can actually make it problematic that white nose syndrome exists?
Yeah, well, so bats live for a long time. They only produce usually about one pup or one baby bat per year. So that means any shot of recovery is going to take a long time, which, further underscores the need to take very cautious conservation measures now to when you go into a cave, clean off your shoes, clean off your jacket, and be thinking about all this stuff because it will take a long time to fix it.
Some of our listeners might be intrigued to now check out Old Newgate Prison for its history, but also the fact that it's home to these different types of bats. But this is a place that's not open year-round.
Yeah, so I'm not sure what the entire hours are on it, but it is definitely, you don't think of copper mines as being a Connecticut thing. You think of, like, my wife's from Arizona, and we visited, caves and mines out there. We think of that that's a West thing, but it's an interesting piece of Connecticut history. It's also kind of a dark and depressing piece of Connecticut's history as well. And yeah, definitely worth checking out. I was a history major when I was in college. I love that stuff. So.
And Patrick, before we let you go, what's next in terms of, continuing to track the bat population and seeing what researchers are learning?
Sure. More winter surveys will be done where scientists go into caves and do things like take the temperature of the cave, spot bats within the cave to kind of see what species are there, what the numbers are. So I think, in the near term, that's research that's ongoing. We had mentioned the bat echolocation research. So those are two things top of mind that come to my head on that.
Patrick Skahill, again, who is the science and environment reporter for Connecticut Public. Thanks for coming in today, and we'll tweet out a link to your latest story at Where We Live.
Thanks.
Today's show produced by Lydia Brown. Special thanks to intern Jared Todd on the phones. I'm Lucy Nalpathanchel. Have a great weekend.